Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack complex source materials and pull out the key insights you need. Today, we're diving into something maybe a bit unexpected, a specific critical view on art and culture, coming from a Marxist perspective.
Yeah, it's true. People often hear that term, that framework, and think, okay, economics, politics, maybe industry, but they assume it just, skips over things like art, music, literature.
That's the common take, yeah. But the sources we've been looking at, these critical essays, historical analyses, they're really clear. They say nothing could be further from the truth. They actually argue the whole point of ending exploitation is tied directly to freeing people up, not just to survive, but to actually enjoy culture, to participate in it.
Exactly. And aiming, ultimately, to raise art to new heights. That's the core idea we're digging into.
It's this kind of counterintuitive claim, isn't it, that the revolutionary goal is actually, well, cultural in the end.
Unlocking human potential, yeah. Creativity that they argue is kind of held back by the current economic setup.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to explore this specific viewpoint on culture. We'll look at how it critiques art now, what potential it sees during big societal shifts like revolutions, and look at some specific artists from history that the sources claim really show this link between social change and creativity. All right, let's get into it. What's the immediate criticism of art under the current system, according to these materials?
Well, the main thing, the phrase that keeps coming up is that art is shackled to the profit motive.
Yeah.
That's really the core of it.
Shackled to profit.
Yeah. So culture stops being this deep reflection or, exploration of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And it turns into, well, just another business, a commodity.
And the first consequence of that, the really tangible one, is just access, right? The sources point out how many of humanity's greatest works, paintings, manuscripts, whatever, are locked up in private collections or reserved for the wealthy.
Precisely. If art's a commodity, then who gets to appreciate it depends on whether you can afford the ticket, basically.
The system decides who gets culture.
Right. But the critique digs deeper than just who gets to see it. It talks about the quality. This framework argues art's become increasingly shallow and pedestrian. And crucially, they say this isn't just like artists losing their touch. They argue it's a direct reflection of the crisis of the capitalist system itself.
That's a big claim, though. Are they saying all modern art is shallow? Or is it more about what gets funded, what gets pushed out to the masses?
It's definitely focused on the distribution mechanism.
Yeah.
The sources argue really strongly that instead of helping artists develop, complex or challenging or even subversive ideas, instead, billions are thrown at derivative dross by a shrinking handful of media monopolies.
Right. The endless sequels, the remakes, the reality shows.
Exactly. It's the safe bet, the low-risk, high-return model that the structure encourages. And that, they argue, stifles real experimentation.
So it's presented as this kind of systemic rot. And you even see that view when they talk about preserving the past, not just creating new stuff. They brought the Notre Dame fire in 2019 and framed that destruction specifically as capitalism destroying our historical heritage, basically through neglect driven by prioritizing profit over, say, proper upkeep.
Yeah, and this sense of decay, of societal rot, it finds its way into literature, too. Literature acts like a mirror, right? The sources really focus on James Joyce's Dubliners. It's described as this masterful critique of the paralysis, hypocrisy, and alienation of Irish bourgeois society in the 20th century.
Okay, quick clarification for listeners. When the sources use bourgeois society there, they mean the established, often kind of conservative middle and upper classes.
Exactly that. The critique is that their economic power created a society, in this case, early 20th century Ireland, that was just culturally suffocating. Joyce, they argue, showed how political stagnation directly led to this personal and cultural paralysis. People felt stuck, unable to act or really live fully.
And then his later work, Ulysses.
Yeah, Ulysses is then held up as revolutionary in its form and how it's written. It breaks all the rules. And that disruption in form is seen as reflecting the societal disruption, challenging all the old literary ways.
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating. If the problem, the rot, is in the economic system, then the sources argue the solution for culture also has to be societal, not just artistic. So where do they look for inspiration? What historical examples suggest a path forward?
They're very direct about it. The solution isn't found in some new art movement itself, but in breaking the capitalist system politically. And they point right at the Russian Revolution in 1917. That's presented as the key example of what can happen when those shackles are even temporarily removed.
And the effect was immediate.
That's the claim, a sudden flood of creativity. And it wasn't just spontaneous energy, there was policy behind it. The Bolsheviks, they flung open the gilded doors of Russia's galleries and opera houses to ordinary people for the first time. Culture was deliberately made accessible.
Democratized, essentially.
Yes, exactly. And that democratization of culture is seen as the essential first step towards the ultimate vision. It's about giving culture back to the masses, through huge state investment in education, in the arts, which leads to that really striking quote from Trotsky about the future human type once this cultural freedom is achieved.
Ah, yes, the quote, "The average human type will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, or a Marx, and above this ridge new peaks will rise." That's quite a statement. Is the idea literally that everyone becomes a genius? Or is it more like rhetorical, inspirational?
The sources tend to read it as visionary inspiration, yeah.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a literal prediction that every single person will be Aristotle. It's more about raising the average level of human experience, knowledge, and cultural engagement. The idea is if the vast majority of people are freed from just struggling to survive day to day, then the potential for intellectual and cultural growth is, well, almost limitless.
Okay. And you see hints of that potential, they argue, in early Soviet cinema.
Right.
Right.
Which saw this incredible flowering of creative expression. People like Dziga Vertov, Sergei Eisenstein. They weren't just making movies, they were actually advancing the art form itself, using film as a weapon of class struggle, as the sources put it.
So the form matched the political goal.
Perfectly. They invented completely new ways of filming and editing, like Verkov's Kino Eye or Eisenstein's montage theory. They had to, really, because the old Hollywood-style storytelling couldn't convey the new revolutionary message they wanted to get across.
So the aesthetic innovation was tied directly to the politics.
Inseparable, according to this view. Educating and mobilizing the masses required new forms.
Sounds like an incredibly dynamic period, artistically speaking.
Oh.
Even if short-lived.
It was. And the sources are very careful to add that crucial historical note. This creative explosion was later cut short by the Stalinist degeneration of the regime.
Right.
Which serves as a kind of warning, doesn't it? That political counter-revolution clamps down on cultural freedom pretty fast. Genuine experimentation gets replaced by state-approved styles, crushing that initial spark.
Okay, so to really grasp this connection the sources draw between social upheaval and artistic creation, we should look at some specific artists they label as revolutionary. It helps show how political conflict, class conflict, shapes what artists produce, even going way back.
Absolutely. And the framing isn't just that artists react to their times, but that they embody the contradictions of their times.
So let's start with Mozart. The material calls him revolutionary, specifically focusing on the Marriage of Figaro. Why was an 18th century opera seen as so radical?
Well, because it basically flipped the class structure upside down on stage. Before Figaro, opera was mostly for the nobility, right? And
Yeah.
heroes were usually kings, gods, mythical figures, high status.
Okay.
Figaro makes a servant the hero, the main character, Figaro. And not only that, he and his fiancée, Susanna, they actually outsmart and expose their boss, the count.
So the aristocrats in the audience were watching a servant win against one of their own.
Exactly. It's like a social revolution playing out right there in the opera house, just before the actual French Revolution kicked off.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Then Beethoven.
Beethoven is described as carrying out the greatest single revolution in modern music. His music wasn't just pretty, it often shocks and disturbs. He lived through incredible turmoil, the French Revolution, Napoleon, the complete shattering of the old European order.
A world in turmoil, as they say.
Right. And his music, particularly the symphonies, captures that feeling, that transition from the old aristocratic world to something new and, frankly, unsettling.
And this isn't just a European thing, right? The sources mentioned the shockwaves of the French Revolution hitting Britain.
Like a thunderbolt,
Yeah.
yeah. And you see it reflected almost immediately in the radical shift in British writers and poets then. Art constantly reacts to the changing world.
So to tie this back to the overall method, the sources look at even earlier figures through this lens of historical materialism, which means, just to clarify, looking at someone like Leonardo da Vinci in the context of his time's economy and social structure, not just seeing him as a lone genius.
Precisely. Understanding them as products of their era, their class relations. Da Vinci is called an absolute giant, a revolutionary in art, science, philosophy. His work comes at the height of the Renaissance, right when a new merchant class was challenging the old feudal system.
And his incredible range, refusing to just specialize.
That reflects the dynamism, the upheaval of the broader society, according to this view.
But maybe the most powerful example they use is Hieronymus Bosch. His paintings from 500 years ago look incredibly modern and terrifying.
Yeah, Bosch's work is seen as anticipating surrealism because it depicts a world that seems to have gone completely mad. The material interprets his art as showing the death agony of feudalism. You have to think about the
The
context.
Black Death.
Constant peasant uprisings, widespread violence, fear, the breakdown of old certainties. It was a time of immense crisis.
So those bizarre, nightmarish figures weren't just fantasy.
The argument is they were reflecting the real nightmare of a social system tearing itself apart. His hellscapes mirrored the terror and chaos of a society collapsing under plague, war, class struggle. Just as clearly, the sources argue, as Joyce's work later reflected the paralysis of 20th century capitalism.
Which brings us right back to today and the core challenge these sources present. The overall message seems clear. Art needs freedom. Freedom to experiment, to grow without commercial demands. But the sources insist it will never be so under the rotten capitalist system because that profit motive always gets in the way.
Right. The challenge from these sources is to stop thinking of art as something totally separate, off in its own little world. Instead, view it as deeply connected to and a product of the dominant social and economic system. It's a potent way to look at culture, whether or not you agree with the political conclusions they draw.
So what does this mean for you listening? Well, these sources offer a critical lens. A way to ask, is the culture we consume actually pushing boundaries, exploring new ideas? Or is it mostly, churning out familiar stuff mainly designed to make money for big companies?
And it leaves us with a really provocative final thought, doesn't it? If artists like Bosch showed the violent end of feudalism and Joyce showed the paralysis of early 20th century capitalism, what art being made now, whether it's painting, film, music, writing, is truly capturing the specific turbulence of our time. The 21st century with its media monopolies, global crises, all of it. What new peaks, to borrow that phrase from Trotsky, should we be looking for today that really reflect the reality of this historical moment we're living through?